Hi everyone, my name's Leon Flicker. I'm calling you or talking from Perth in Western Australia. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, and I'm sure that Lorna will be acknowledging the traditional owners of New Zealand. This is an international conference. We are across Australia and New Zealand, and we have listeners and participants from overseas as well, including the United Kingdom. I'd like to acknowledge our sponsors, and our sponsors are the Australian Association of Gerontology, the New Zealand Association of Gerontology, and the Australian New Zealand Society for Geriatric Medicine. Today we'll have three speakers. I will be the second one. The first one will be Dr. Eddie Strivens, who is the geriatrician in charge of the Cairns Geriatric Medical Service and Aged Care Assessment Team, and he'll be talking about dementia and dementia assessment tools. The third speaker will be Dr. Lorna Dial, who is a senior lecturer in Maori Health based at Auckland University and also works in the general practice department there as well. Now, we'll each have a relatively short presentation, and during that time you may think of questions. If you can use the chat device at the bottom left of your screen, and I might let you all just practice now by chatting in, putting in in that spot, if you could just put in where you are and what the weather is like, and that way you will see how it will come around from all around Australasia. You'll see that it will appear in that screen. So if you could just all practice that whilst we're getting ready, and I'll start. So this topic today is Indigenous Ageing, Tools for Better Practice, and Eddie will be talking about dementia assessment and dementia in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Eddie, would you like to start?
Thanks, Leon, and hello to everyone. This is a new format for me, so I'm enjoying the technology, being an early adopter of this stuff, so I'm quite enjoying the experience, and hopefully the talk I give won't be too painful. So as well as Leon and Lorna, I'd like to acknowledge certainly the traditional owners of the land in which I'm giving the presentation from today. And with any of these sort of talks and work, there's an awful lot of people to help, especially my colleagues in the Healthy Ageing Research Team up in the far north, Sarah Russell and Gavin Miller and Sharon. And especially like to thank Leon for the work that the Kika team did, and Tony Bro from the Kuri Growing Old Well study, and thank them for some of the slides that Kate and Dina have also helped with as well. And also thank all the people up in the Torres Strait and Cape York that we've worked with over the last 10 years and more. So really what I guess as the first speaker today, my job is at least partly to set the scene. So we're talking about assessment tools, and I'm talking in particular about dementia. And if we're talking about ageing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, who exactly are we talking about? Well, we know that life expectancy is reduced, and we know some of the shocking statistics of the gap between life expectancy between all Australian populations and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. And I think perhaps the most shocking stat of all is that one that 75% of Aboriginal men are dead by the age of 65, compared with only 26% of the non-Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander population. And we also know that if we're looking at ageing, we know that some of the diseases of ageing can occur at a younger age as well. We demonstrated that up here through stroke studies that showed the mean age of presentation was around 12 years less. We take that a little bit further and think about some of the diseases we see in midlife, especially the diseases that carry with them a high vascular risk. A study that our team up here did, 15 years ago now, really showed prevalence of hypertension and diabetes amongst the highest that you see in the world, around 50 to 60% in the Torres Strait. And certainly both Leon's group and Tony's group down in New South Wales have shown similar statistics of very high levels of hypertension and diabetes. And what does that mean, I guess, if we're looking at cognitive impairment and dementia? Well, I think it's important to think that really up until a few years ago, there were really competing hypotheses as to what you might see. Are you seeing too much, or are you seeing dementia at a younger age? Because we've got those competing hypotheses, if you like, of if you're seeing a population as we're seeing with a lower life expectancy, and we know the biggest single risk factor for the development of dementia is increasing age, then are we going to see low rates? But then if you think of those statistics I've shown already with the high rate of vascular disease and other stresses, and this is not just medical things, these are some of the issues of education and social engagement, which can also have an impact on the development of the brain and dementia later on in life. Up until some of the first Kimberley prevalence study, really Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander dementia prevalence was really not known. We know overall in the population that we see a rate in the over 65s of about 6.5%. And from looking at our referrals 10 or 15 years ago, we were seeing it as a primary diagnosis in sort of 1 in 8 of our referrals. And equally, a study that was done out of Townsville looking at an Indigenous version of the psychogeriatric assessment scale showed rates of about 1 in 5. But compare this to a pretty good quality study done out of North America showing lower rates amongst the Cree Native American population. So the other thing that I guess is important if we're talking about assessment is the idea that a study done out of the Northern Territory and a report from a get-together of a lot of interested parties in Darwin suggested that Indigenous Australians were not being diagnosed until quite late-stage dementia, and this was a decade ago now. But I'm now going to ask the question and make sure everyone's still awake as well, and use the new technology of asking you why that might be. So you're now going to see a poll come up on your screen where you've got just a couple of minutes. Just click on what you think. Is it due to language and cultural reasons? Is it due to problems with a specific assessment tool? Is it due to a high tolerance to behavioural change associated with dementia, or is it due to lack of access to specialist services? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to click on this. It's a bit like the worm in the sort of leader debates leading up to the election. It's quite fun. I can see the colours changing rapidly. So we're seeing specialist services taking an early lead, followed up closely by tolerance to behavioural changes, and also lack of a specific assessment tool and language and cultural reasons. So I think probably, as most of you have seen from your responses on that, but actually what we're seeing is that the reality is it's probably a combination of all four of those. And what that report really showed is the importance, I guess, of language and cultural factors, and especially if you're looking in some of the areas of the Territory and northern Western Australia, where you have a much lower level of people speaking English as a first language and multiple different Indigenous languages, and also some of the issues of dementia awareness, if you like, and looking at whether behavioural changes are actually a normal part of ageing. But for me, one of the big issues and what looked at my interest here was the lack of a specific assessment tool. This was where, we saw great things out of Western Australia with Kate and Dina and Leon working on the Kimberley Indigenous Cognitive Assessment, which was really developed in a response for needing a validated screening tool in older rural populations. Now, the bit that's been looked at most thoroughly is the cognitive assessment section, and that's been now validated across the whole of the top end, and has been shown to be effective in all those groups. Up in far north Queensland, we actually for the first time validated an assessment tool in the Torres Strait Islander population using the more screening version, but all of the studies really showed that this is an effective tool in rural and regional Australia. So now you have an assessment tool, and the assessment tool is really based around questions of orientation, verbal fluency, and memory tests using a more picture base. you can then go on to look at dementia prevalence and how common dementia is. Now, the Kimberley prevalence study looked at over 350 Aboriginal people in Derby and 6 other communities and used the KICA survey tool, some of which Leon will be talking about a little bit more in the next talk. And probably a lot of you are aware of the somewhat shocking results of this in terms of the high prevalence of dementia, and that we were seeing rates of around 5 times what you'd see in the non-Aboriginal population, and high levels also of SIND, which is cognitive impairment, not dementia, or mild cognitive impairment as well. And again, a lot of the times we ask a lot of questions about what types of dementia are we seeing, and we are seeing Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementias. It's not all alcohol or substance-related dementias as well. Although at the time of the study, there were a lot of dementias not otherwise defined. And I think the risk factors are important as well when we're looking at assessment of dementia and assessment of ageing generally, because we're seeing some difference across what you'd see or what you'd expect to see, with more dementia in male populations, and also that association with a lack of formal education and with vascular disease and head injuries, which, if we're talking about management as well, really gives you opportunities for prevention. Because although we can't do much about our age, we can do something about educational opportunities, and we can potentially do stuff about smoking and head injuries. Now, thanks again to Tony and the team down in New South Wales as well for some of the information on the Koori Growing Old Well study, and had the opportunity of Tony being up here relatively recently and talking to some of our community-controlled health organisations up here, which has been tremendously valuable. But again, this is a prevalence study that is looking not just not at rural communities, but looking at urban Aboriginal communities around La Perouse and also on the North Coast, and taking identifying over 500 people, but really performing more in-depth cognitive assessments on over 300. Interesting differences in the population because of issues of identifying the census group. They went for over 60 rather than over 45, and the big difference is and similar to what we found in our study in the far north, lot higher or lot lower levels of English as a second language. Also higher levels of formal education, but Tony makes the point very well. Just because you've attended school doesn't mean you've necessarily got benefits, and people were sometimes in those days attending without actually getting the educational content. But important differences in the groups. But despite those differences, you're still seeing an increased dementia prevalence. So you're seeing round about 3 times the non-Indigenous rate compared to 5 times in the Kimberley study. And again, the types of dementia are very much in keeping with what we saw. It's Alzheimer's, vascular disease, head trauma related, and again with a very high proportion of mild cognitive impairment. Looking at the risk factors in the KGAM study and comparing that to Leon's study in the Kimberley, we're seeing some similar themes here in terms of a male predominance, issues of education and head injuries and epilepsy, as well as those vascular risk factors. So if we look again compared to that study, we can see that between the Kimberley and New South Wales there are some common themes developing. So last of all, I just wanted to talk a bit about the early pilot work we've done in the Torres Strait, and this has come very much as part of a community partnership. We've always worked very closely with the primary health services there, and there's been a real interest and passion from some of the health workers up there and also the councils up there to look at dementia. So we actually did a pilot study last year on Hammond Island, which is a smallish island just off Thursday Island, which is the main population centre. And we actually managed to survey 20 out of the 28 identified population over the age of 45 on the island, most were Torres Strait Islanders and most were born on Hammond. And, you know, again, similar to the study in New South Wales, 100% spoke English as a primary or co-primary language with a mean formal education of 7.5 years. Now, I think it's very difficult and taking very long bow in a pilot study to make a lot of comments about dementia prevalence, but we certainly saw that there were 1 in 4 of the people that we surveyed had some form of cognitive impairment. And again, we're seeing that vascular risk factors are important, that we're seeing that diabetes is overrepresented, as is heart disease, as are head injuries, as are smoking history in the group of people with cognitive impairment. So I think this lends on nicely to talk a little bit about that journey through life, and you know, I think Tony and the group down in New South Wales really have approached this in a fantastic manner to think not just about healthy ageing beginning when you hit 45 or 55 or 65, but it's that entire journey through life that affects your risk for dementias and other chronic diseases. We know that the brain grows most in the first decade and a half of life, so if you don't get the opportunity there, you're not going to grow the brain. And in midlife, the development of chronic diseases and other health conditions through your 20s, 30s and 40s is when you need to mind your brain. And later on in life, as we prime ourselves for neurodegeneration, it's about saving the brain. And I guess those known risk factors for dementia are also, you know, risk factors for chronic disease as well. And they're things that we can do something about potentially. Education, head injuries, and vascular risk factors are potentially ameliorable to impact early on in life. So it's not often you get geriatricians talking about antenatal care and paediatric care, but that's where the money is. So it's also worth thinking about that you know, there is some evidence behind this, is that childhood events can impact on brain networks later on in life. You know, you use it or lose it, and you grow it early on in life. And we also know that cortisol levels in stress can actually be directly neurotoxic to some of those key memory areas. And that has a potential impact then on priming your brain for problems later on in life. So just ending up now, I guess to put the point of where we go to next, and I think some of what we've been doing is really based around those partnerships and collaboration parts. This is part of the National Indigenous Dementia Strategy from Alzheimer's Australia. And I've been really amazed, I guess, over the last 12 months at the interest that the community-controlled health organisations up here at Digimeter and Apuna Pima and the group out at Yarrabah have really been very interested in looking at the next level of managing chronic disease. You know, there's been a lot of work put into midlife diseases, but I guess now a lot of communities are seeing, you know, the potential problems later on in life if we don't consider what might happen with dementia. And I think those workforce issues and research, and we're hoping to look at more prevalence work in the Torres Strait as well, linked very much with care and support and community work. So with that, I'll just put my contact details in case you want to get hold of me, as well as the Aboriginal Ageing Group with the KGAL study and Leon's website there as well. So I shall hand back over to Leon for the next part of the talk and be glad to answer questions later on.
Thanks, Eddie. Just as you see that last slide, if you want the Kicker COG, the Kimberley Indigenous Cognitive Assessment, you can get it off the Watcher website, which is the second website on that slide. And it's freely available, and it's also on the website you'll get the manual, and also there's an instruction video if you need it as well. All right, so I will, now I'm going to be talking about tools for better practice. I'm going to be talking about other assessment tools, and besides cognitive assessment. And this is probably an area which isn't as clearly defined as we just heard about cognitive assessment, because we've done quite a bit of work, and now Tony Bro's group has done quite a bit of work, and Eddie, of course, as well, in validating the kicker cog for assessing people with cognitive impairment, Indigenous people in remote and rural areas, and with Tony as well in urban areas. So there's been quite a bit of work now. The work I'm going to talk about now is the other areas besides cognition. So I'll just remind everybody that we have what is called a biopsychosocial model in ageing. And we, of course, don't just think about the health condition, but we're very interested in disability, the ability of people, how those health conditions affect the body functions, and how that can cause limitations in activities. And when we think about limitations in activities, it's not, of course, just medical, it's not just health-related, but there's a lot of personal and family issues and environmental factors, and that affects people's participation in things, and that's often what people are most concerned about. So there's a fairly broad model here that involves more than just the health condition, and in fact even more than just the disability, the way the health condition actually causes problems in doing things. So I thought I'd just mention that. And the other thing I'll just mention, and the work I'm doing here is work that largely has been led by my colleague Dina Lejudice, and with a lot of assistance from Kate Smith, David Atkinson, Steve Fenner, Ruth Crawford, Steph Waters. There's been a lot of people involved in this study for a long time who have all made major contributions. And as well as that, there's been major contributions from the Indigenous people in Derby and 6 relatively small communities in the Kimberley. And we've had a lot of assistance with local Indigenous people, local Aboriginal people who've been interpreters and research assistants over the years in these areas. So I'd just like to acknowledge them first. Now, one of the problems that Eddie alluded to is that before we had the kicker, there wasn't an assessment tool that would be useful for Aboriginal people. And this is what the World Health Organization recommends for development of assessment tools for different cultural backgrounds. And one of the things about it in Australia is that for a long time we didn't think we needed to develop assessment tools for Aboriginal people because they were Australian people, right? We didn't necessarily consider that. And it was wrong of us. You know, we got that wrong because we didn't think about the full complexity of it. So the first thing you do when you do any assessment tools is you think about what you actually want to measure, the dimensions of what you want to do, and what sort of criteria, diagnosis, whatever was. And then the very first thing you do is you have a consultation with the people you're trying to measure that tool on. And then you might develop a few items, and particularly, again, with Aboriginal people, you might want to actually translate it into Aboriginal language and then back translate it. And now people think, oh, you don't necessarily need that step. Believe me, you do, because sometimes what you think makes sense, when it gets translated, it comes into gibberish, and then when they try to back translate it, you realize that. So often, if you don't do this step, I can see Lorna smiling because, you know, this is what we always find. If you don't do this step, you often get caught out. And then you have to see whether people are happy with it, and then you often revise it. It's an iterative process, and then you try and work it out against a gold standard to validate it and see if it's reliable and things like that. So it's actually a process you have to go through. And I think we've gone through that process largely with the kicker, but not necessarily with the other instruments I'm going to say, but describe now. But they might be helpful for people, and we are in the processes of validating them completely. So I'll just explain what I'm talking about. Oh, and the other thing about when you use any of these instruments, just some really basic things that, again, people don't necessarily think it's important, but it really is. You have to try and find a quiet place when you're not going to have too many interruptions, And even though the remote communities, there seems to be a lot of space, there's often a lot of things happening. So you try to find a place that not many things, and that's the same wherever you go, in urban settings or rural settings, wherever. Many remote Aboriginal people, particularly older people, don't necessarily speak English as their first language. They'll often speak a Creole or an Aboriginal language as their first language, and they won't necessarily feel that comfortable with English, and they may not have a full understanding of it. And once again, like every other different cultural background, you try to find an independent interpreter rather than a family member, because a family member often will answer for them or try to cover, because they feel it's being compassionate to cover up some older person's mistakes, and you're not quite getting the full picture. So it's important to try and get an interpreter. And there's also, besides the language issues, there's also the cultural factors which are in addition. For example, often women won't deal with a male interpreter properly, or they won't have that same comfort with that. So you might have to acknowledge that and try to get people from the same sex involved as interpreters. So and there's different family groups and so on that people may not be comfortable with that particular interpreter. So you just have to acknowledge that and just make sure that's okay. All right, so this is the sort of things that you might want to do. And one of the things, and this is the assessment tool that we used in the Kicker study for the ADL functioning, and this is actually available from the ACAT assessment toolkit. So, and I suspect it's probably as validated as we're going to get now. So this is the idea of trying to work out things that are important for rural and remote Aboriginal people about how you ask the questions. And these questions, now that we've used it quite a bit, these questions translate sensibly and translate back sensibly. So, you know, sort of, can you shower both yourself? Do you need help? Can you take your medicine? Do you need help? And that's one of the really important things, to sort of understand how much help somebody really requires with these functions. And you're basically asking ADLs, activities of daily living, and instrumental activities of daily living, in ways that people sort of can follow and that they understand in their own lives, because that's important. You don't really want to do the same things that you necessarily would do in an urban environment. Now, this is a depression scale, and I might add that this is new. We had a previous depression scale from about 7 years ago, and it's on our website. It actually didn't work that well. So this is a new scale which seems to be working much better. And what we've done is we've adapted some of the questions that we use in non-Aboriginal people, and this is just put in a way that seems to be more relevant to older Aboriginal people. So, for example, you might ask the question, do you feel bad about yourself or felt shame that you have let yourself or family down? That's a fairly common question. That's a fairly common item that people will respond to in Aboriginal people. That's a very important part of their lives. And that is associated with the feeling of depression, of sadness. So I'll just move on. And we found quite high rates of depression and major depression when we confirmed it when people scored more than 9 points on that scale. So that's one of the reasons why you want to do it. You want to find people who have a problem that needs to be addressed. And that's just showing the ROC curve. I won't go into that, but just showing that it's got reasonable sensitivity and specificity. This is another important problem for older Aboriginal people, pain. And it's often hard to get people to talk about pain and distinguish physical pain from emotional pain and other. Now, I'm not sure. There's some people around Australia struggling with the sound. I'm not sure if I can do anything on this end. I'm not sure if Michelle can help at all. Anyway, so I'll just explain. So this is the sort of some of the questions that we might do with pain. And one of the things that Aboriginal people are quite good at is actually directing you on a body image about where the pain is, because that often makes it clearer. And the other thing that, and so we find that pain is reasonably common, which is not necessarily different from older people generally, but actually the more severe and persistent pain is more common in older Aboriginal people. And these are people over the age of 45. So that people seem to be having pain for a long time and not necessarily getting all that much help with it. One of the things about trying to work out how bad pain is, that in non-Aboriginal people, we often talk about what's the pain score 1 to 10. That didn't work at all, right? So that Aboriginal people didn't get that. And we also looked at a visual analogue scale, which is, a scale that has a line about this long, and then you try to put the pain mark on it. That didn't work at all. This did. So this is like the target where a little pain on the left and big mob pain on the right, that people got. And we were able to point reasonably closely where they thought the pain severity was. Similarly, we've got this fall screen, which we're in the process of validating, seems to work. And one of the things, we've kept the questions relatively simple, but one of the things that we've done is just watch the person walk and see if it looks abnormal and how long they've taken. And we find that firstly, that falls are very common in people aged over the age of 45. Not necessarily people think in remote communities that this is a common problem, but it is. And that we also find that people often have quite a slow gait. 23% of people took longer than 10 seconds to walk 5 metres, which is suggesting that these people have a problem which is interfering with their walking. And lastly, one of the things that we've also been looking at is incontinence. And again, it's asking these questions. These questions have changed from last time. We got a very low rate of incontinence, continence problems last time, and we've changed the questions to make them much more straightforward. And so for the first question, many people sometimes leak gumbo, urine, wee or piss, and you actually use all 4 of the synonyms, right? They're just synonyms. Does it ever happen to you? And how often do you leak gumbo, urine, wee or piss? And how much gumbo do you leak? So these are very straightforward questions, right? And this time we got 3 times the rate of continence problems simply by asking the question a bit better. So again, indicating very high rates of, these are people over the age of 45 years, right? Not 65 or 70. So again, very high rates of continence problems. So I just want to leave it there, but as you can see, there's issues about actually trying to ask these questions in a sensible way that people understand, that they feel comfortable answering. I might let Lorna go on now, and we'll have questions right at the end. Lorna.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina hawesa, tina koutou katoa. Greetings to all the people online. This is my first time I've ever done a webinar, so if I make a mistake, please forgive me. Now, I'm following on after 2 very distinguished speakers who are very knowledgeable in this area, and I am not. I am from Ngāti Maniapoto. I'm one of 526,000 Māori in 2006 who self-identified as Māori. And you can see here some members of my research team that I've had the great privilege of working with, and colleagues in my office here having a good laugh. Now, I was asked, and I was very embarrassed, but they asked me to contribute. And so I said, well, why look at what questions could I offer, as I'm not a clinician. I've worked in Māori Health for many years. I enjoy working with the Māori community, and working with my own people is my own passion. So I thought the questions that I could think about was, why look at the life course of Māori, and especially those in advanced age, that is 80 years plus? Why is it important to address the social, economic, cultural justice determinants of life throughout the life course? Why is it important to prevent and where possible delayed onset of chronic health conditions, including mental health conditions? And why focus on dementia in advanced stage when it's related to poor health? And this is a very interesting question. I'm having a lot of discussion in New Zealand. Is dementia related to ageing, or is it related to biological impairment? So I'm a great privilege to be a member of the Life and Living in Advanced Age in New Zealand called the Lilac Study. Now this study arose from a feasibility study in which we interviewed 100 people between 75 and 79, which has laid the foundation for this cohort study. At the end of the study, we were given the name Te Pūwaitanga o Ngā Tapawai Ke Ora Tono, Blossoming of Life, from a group of elders who have a specific role in the study called Te Rōpū Kaitiaki o Ngā Tikanga Māori. They are the protectors of the principles of conduct for research and cultural knowledge and practice. Now this group of elders have continued to work with us in the cohort study and have played a very important role in helping us to maintain community connections, doing the translation of our different screening tools, and basically keeping us researchers on track. Now, I'm not an expert on cognition, but I did go and look at the Alzheimer's Disease International Report, which was released in 2011 by a group of experts in this area, and it is a report that I was referred to by a senior colleague to look at in terms of cognitive impairment, and to my surprise and disappointment was the invisibility of Indigenous populations. Now in this report, which is obviously meant to be used across the globe to help different decision makers in different countries to consider the importance of dementia and the growing size of this problem, that there was no mention of Indigenous population, but they did identify that in low to modern high income economies that you would find a high level of prevalence of cognitive impairment, which suggests that possibly in New Zealand and perhaps in Australia, perhaps more wealthy enough, and particularly Indigenous populations which do not have the same incomes as other populations, we can expect to see a higher prevalence of cognitive impairment. I'd say cognitive impairment is linked to the life course and the loss of human potential, and that to me is extremely sad. When I got involved in the Lilac study, people asked why are we looking at those people in a really advanced age. Currently, Māori represent 14% of the total New Zealand population, and those who are predominantly European, aged over 65 years, are the same size as the Māori population. The Māori population over 65 years of age is 3%. But our population of those over 65 is expected to increase over the next decade to become 7%, whereas the Pākehā, or the dominant population, will increase at least again by 50%. Now the Lilac study enrolled 422 Māori aged 80 to 90 years. They were born between 1920 and 1930. Now I would describe these people as our elite survivors. Are the 1% that survived the year that they were born with their peers. We took an equal power sampling methodology because we wanted to have the same number of Māori as non-Māori, that is those aged 85 in the cohort study. We received a 6% response rate in the area of study. We have just been documenting the baseline results for both the Māori and the non-Māori components cohort. What we've found to our delight is that the Māori participants enrolled in the Lilac study are alive. They're vibrant, they flourish if they are able to speak to their Māori and practice their culture where possible on a daily basis. Those who live in their hapu or tribal area enjoy better nutrition, visit marae as a sacred meeting place often, speak with kin to their Māori, and enjoy a higher quality of life. They also play an important role in the intergenerational transfer of knowledge. So they are very important people in our community. So one of the things that I thought about, instead of focusing on the negative, we could ask, how can Indigenous populations learn from their elders who are elite survivors to protect their brain function? What cognitive skills have elders learned from their experience of life which has enabled them to survive, which could assist the development of others? So focusing on the positive and the contribution that this population can give to those following behind. Now, the World Alzheimer's Report, as I mentioned before, in 2011, identified that there's a lack of detection is a significant barrier to improving the lives of people with Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementia. They recommend that earlier diagnosis is the best practice if communicated well to assist the person and others to make key decisions. High prevalence of dementia for Indigenous populations means, in many respects, that they may lose resources gained from treaty and litigation settlements. So this is a big issue now for Maori who've just managed to negotiate through their tribal groups basically some form of settlement, which basically are now developing an economic base. For those who may be given shares or now able to pay off their home, if they require institutionalised care, they may lose their assets. Now, the World Alzheimer's Report recommends that if we are to screen for cognitive impairment, we should focus at a primary health care level. There should be community education, that you should involve people who are knowledgeable and skilled to support people with dementia. So I recognise the importance of actually having people who are bicultural, bilingual, they are from those communities, they're able to communicate with those people that you wish to screen, and that they're knowledgeable of Indigenous systems. So it's important that they understand the structures, the tribal structures in those communities, their histories, and the networks within family structures. So as we're at a new stage of development across the globe in relation to cognitive impairment, often Indigenous people are used, in many respects, I hate to say it, as guinea pigs for research, but perhaps Indigenous populations now can learn from other populations which are chronically older in profile and are likely to have a higher prevalence of early onset and ongoing process of Alzheimer's disease and have enjoyed the social, economic and cultural benefits across the life course. So what can Indigenous population learn from the oldest old and other populations about cognitive impairment? And what can Indigenous populations share with other populations who have a growing prevalence of dementia and may have enjoyed a different life course due to where they live, culture and opportunities available? So for Maori, we have found that our culture is a protector to our well-being. So what we do know that those in advanced age, in many respects, are at the frontiers of research, that many researchers are interested in the chronological process of ageing as well as the biological process of ageing. I'd say working with Indigenous populations and subpopulations is a privilege, and therefore we must recognise and respect diversity. As you mentioned, Leon, questions in a standardised cognitive assessment may not be appropriate to a particular community, and so therefore we need to be reviewed as to appropriateness. And the purpose of assessment needs to be clear. Are we measuring intelligence, or are we measuring how the brain functions? For watching my elders, they were not sure whether we were measuring their intelligence, and so therefore they were fearful. We were interested in how their brain functions, so if they were having difficulties, what support we could offer them. And I think it's very important to be clear, what are we doing? Now in the 1990s, I was involved with a group of Maori people, and we developed a series of principles of screening, which I thought could apply to any area. And I thought these principles may actually help other Indigenous people to think about what would be the principles of screening that they would get involved in cognitive impairment. So here in New Zealand, we must recognise the Treaty of Waitangi. We need an appropriate integrated primary health care system in place. It's no point screening if we don't have a system in place to respond. We need to recognise social and economic injustices. We need the requirement of intersectional collaboration relationships between different agencies like health, education, employment, justice, corrections, the mental health system, and so forth. We need to recognise the interdependence between across different health workers, scope of practice. So the primary health care worker and the specialist as yourself, Leon, we've been working with an expert in a memory clinic. We need to recognise the barriers which impede access to health care, such as cost, appropriateness, or is there discrimination within the services that we're offering? We need to actively involve those at risk or affected by the condition and define the health problem and appropriate solutions. So we don't use people just as subjects. So I guess if we are going to get involved in cognitive impairment, it needs to be people-focused. We need to recognise that people with dementia have multiple needs, often not just health needs, they have a wider range of needs. We need collaboration between across different agencies. I have been very privileged to be involved in the development of whānau ora, which is a national policy initiative here in New Zealand that now many hapu and iwi and whānau are involved. And that may provide us an Indigenous model which focuses on the whānau and the life course and intergeneration to address a whole range of problems, and that includes dealing with health problems early. I guess now we are here more in terms of our population, where when half the population is moving into early to midlife, the importance of the prevention of chronic health conditions. And so one of the problems is actually getting people to manage those problems early and so to prevent further impairment. So if we are to think about screening for Indigenous populations, we might want to think is what problems would be appropriate to guide screening for your Indigenous population so that those with the condition are not exploited or abused by those interested in this new area of medicine and science to identify new knowledge or solutions to address dementia. So in the LILAC study, we've implemented a code of conduct where all researchers and providers have to agree to. We have developed a set of values in our code of conduct, and that has been very helpful as our research develops. What protections do you think should be in place to ensure that those people in advanced age, especially marginalised Indigenous populations, are not exploited for their knowledge or biological material from researchers, medical practitioners, health and social workers, from policy and legislation? So we've developed a code of conduct of how we deal with blood. We have a whole process of how we share blood to other researchers for investigation. We have a whole publishing code of conduct and so forth. How do Indigenous kinship groups and communities ensure that they are not exploited from researchers due to the nature of their health and health conditions, as their health is related to biological aging, not necessarily chronological ages? Our Kaitiaki group has made sure that our elders are not exploited. So in conclusion, I guess I'd like to say that good health and quality of life for Indigenous populations is related to the historical and current health and social economic injustices. And for those elders who've reached the pinnacle of their lives, the elite survivors, it is important to learn from them how have they navigated their lives. They may be lessons which they can share to those following behind. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa.
Thanks very much, Lorna. We now have got the question and answer session. I've already seen three. The first one is more of a comment. Brownie Dale noted that the National Ageing Research Institute has completed some guides for clinicians in the areas of pain, depression, falls, dementia and incontinence, and we're hoping to have them up on the website at Watcher very soon. So that will be, so those of you who were looking at some of the questionnaires and so on that I was indicating, those you will have it available on the webinar presentation in a couple of days when it's available from Savio, but there will also be the guides on the Watcher website, which NARI, National Ageing Research Institute, has also participated. One of the other questions was the need for a nutrition instrument. I totally agree, but it's going to be a tough one to work out, because one of the things about any Indigenous community in Australia and probably New Zealand is that money is often in short supply for nutrition, as well as the overall issue. So it's a wider psychosocial context that you have to think about nutrition, and also exactly how you measure it, and whether you do it on measures of body fat, which can be done easily, or whether you do it on questionnaires. So there's a lot of issues about that, and that's quite a big ask. That's not an easy one. at all. Somebody asked about whether the reason why we use the walking speed rather than the timed up and go. The timed up and go is a short test where you get up from a chair, walk 3 metres and come back. And the problem for there is actually the availability of the chair. In a lot of remote communities, you don't have a standardised chair in any way, and it's quite hard to bring. So that's why, you know, one of the simple practical problems that, you know, that could be a problem. Now, I think I've dealt with those questions. I don't know, Eddie or Lorna, have you seen any questions you want to talk about now?
The nutrition question is a very good one, and certainly something we've been very interested in looking at. It was brought up by some of the local council groups in the Torres Strait, as well as looking at a measure of traditionalness of diet, because there's a big difference between some of the different islands in the Torres Strait as to availability of food, but also how much, you know, sort of local stuff is cooked and farmed and fished locally. So it's as Leon said, it's a very difficult question because there isn't a tool out there that can be easily adapted, but it is something we're very interested in looking at as well.
Lorna, did you want to comment at all?
We, in Wave 2, asked our participants to record over a 24-hour period what they consumed, and we used a photograph, like a book, and they could flick through what they ate and how much they ate in terms of size. And we also looked at where they got their food from. So if it came from a particular packet, we looked at what was in the ingredients. That was quite a complicated process. A lot of people felt we were looking at how much money they spent on food in terms of the, you know, where they bought expensive branding of particular type. It is a very sensitive area, and we're just now going through the analysis, not only to look at what they ate, but the nutrient values of the food that they ate.
Yeah, it's a very complex question, isn't it? Because sharing food is such a basic part of life, isn't it? Yep.
What we found, I would be interested to see how much traditional food that people eat. What we found, those people who lived in their tribal area were more likely to eat food that was part of their culture. So they were able to eat seafood, they were brought kaimawana, where people who were outside the area didn't have access to that support.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a couple more questions. I'm not sure I'm able to answer them. One of them's asked if the language used in the tools is local to WA communities. It's pretty widespread in the WA communities, but I'm not sure whether things like gumbo and so on are in throughout. Eddie, does it translate to Northern Queensland?
No, we really had to look at different phrasing, and that's where the importance of actually having the trained translators and cultural support people with any of those questionnaires, and ideally actually administered by them rather than in translation. So yeah, I think we found that some of those terms were really not common to either Cape York or the Torres Strait, and with the multiple different cultural and language groups, you really have to get specific for that particular community.
The other question was, can we adapt the questionnaire for Indigenous people to other Indigenous communities outside Australia? It's a very interesting question. We have had discussions with a Canadian group who are doing just that. But of course, it'll have to be adapted quite a bit. But they've been looking at our cognitive assessment tool for First Nation people in Canada. And so that's, yeah, it's potentially a very interesting area. One of the things that we tried to do with the Kicker cog was we tried to make it education and cultural bias relatively little, which means that it might be appropriate, but you'd have to actually do the study. You'd actually have to make sure about that. Somebody's asked about quality of life. We haven't got really a good handle of that in our questions at this stage. I don't know if, Lorna, do you have something that you think might be appropriate for quality of life?
We've used the usual measures of quality of life. What I was going to suggest, one of the advantages of having our Te Rōpū Kaitiaki Tikanga Māori group is that they have been able to translate some of these concepts into the language of the participants. We had similar issues as you. Our elders, 80 to 90, Te Reo Māori was their first language. That was the language that they were brought up. So English was second. So what I would suggest that you think about establishing such a group wherever you work in your communities, because they will know the language or the words appropriate for those communities. We had to use different Māori words to acknowledge the different tribal groups that we were involving in the study. So there is common principles, and I think we could probably develop questions across different Indigenous populations and think about how we might ask that, but record some answers.
Right. There's a question from Sharon addressed to Eddie and Leon. How can we utilise the more strategic and broad research principles from Lorna and her team to enhance the Aboriginal Ageing Research Program in Australia? And I think that's, in many ways we have tried some parts of it, but maybe not as comprehensively as Lorna and her team. I think that it really is not just a part of the research, of course. This is actually a part of how you actually translate the research when you start talking about the positive experiences of older people and how they can be translated to other parts of the community. Eddie, did you want to comment?
No, I think it's a great comment and a great question, because I'm being tremendously impressed both with Lorna's presentation today, but also hearing the presentation of the Lilac stuff before on just that total integration and ownership of the issues and the way that it's dealt with. I think we can learn a lot from those strategies. And I think also, as Leon said, the importance of linking any of this. This is not about, sort of finding out an answer for the answer's sake. It's about linking it to good service provision and a service provision that's being requested from the communities themselves. I mean, we're seeing less money being spent on an iller population, and without the adequate tools to find the problem, then we struggle to actually get adequate service provision and a fair slice of the pie for especially some of the remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So it's linking those research principles with good service provision as well.
Annie's asked the question, how do you deal with translation of concepts? This is what we have difficulty of in the administration of the Kinka. It's always difficult. In the Kinka, we've tried to make the concepts at least partly Aboriginal friendly or neutral, at least, which is the problem with things like the mini mental state, which weren't, the concepts were often foreign. One of the things about all this area is that when you're in service provision, it's really important to have a good Aboriginal liaison or Aboriginal health worker. It's best to have an Aboriginal or Indigenous doctor or nurse if you can get them, but often they're in short supply. But a good Aboriginal health worker or liaison worker often is very good at translating the concepts and explaining the processes, because they've seen it before and they're part of the team and they know how to really bring it back to the people concerned. Eddie, do you want to comment?
Yeah, look, I think that's where you often find that, certainly up in the Torres Strait and a lot of the Cape communities, although the language isn't as much of an issue as perhaps it is in the Kimberley, it's just getting those concepts and that cultural safety of having a person working with you who's going to be able to work those concepts into the contact. Whereas, it's not that it's a matter of a straightforward translation of the words, it's also an adaptation of the concepts
Yep. And I think finally we're just on time. I've got this last question from Pascal. Have you heard of the SEI Qual tool that's been used for Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory? I'm sorry, I haven't. Eddie or Lorna? It's a quality, by the looks of it, it's a quality of life tool, but...
Love to see it though, Pascal. Be nice to see it.
Yeah, yes. Lorna? No luck.
We use the SF12. That's who we use at our system.
Yep. All right. Well, I'm afraid we're right on time at 11. So I'm afraid. Before I forget, please could everyone do their evaluation? Savio is very keen to have the evaluation done on this. I'm not quite sure how it's sent out, but if you could do that, please. If you liked us, fill it in twice. If you didn't like it, just don't fill it in at all. But anyway, just if you could all do the evaluation. So we'll sign off now. It's right on 11, so I think we better go. We will try and make the PowerPoints available to everyone. So, Lorna, are you happy with that too? Eddie? Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.